Hello and welcome to Virtual Monsterama 2020. I am Darren Bush. I'm the co-director of the Lit track this year at Monsterama. We are here for the panel Size Does Matter, Writing Big Monsters. I have a group of big authors with me here tonight. We're going to go ahead and get started with introductions before we get into the meat of the panel. I'm going to start with the lovely and talented Sarah right here. Introduce yourself to our audience, please.
Hi, I'm Sarah. My debut novel released from the Parliament House last year. It's called Double Crossing the Bridge. It's about a group of drunk trolls who pull a perilous heist. I've also had some short fiction published in both Jordan Con anthologies, or one is to be published. And I've been featured in Writer's Digest and written for their blog, as well as done some articles for Dan Cobalt's Science and Science Fiction Fact and Fantasy blog series.
Excellent, thank you. And James, you want to introduce yourself?
I am James Palmer. I write science fiction and pulp adventure. One of my claims to fame, as it were, is I'm the editor of a series of anthologies called Monster Earth. It's a shared world, alternate history, giant monster, kaiju anthology.
Excellent. And Bobby?
I'm Bobby Nash. I write all kinds of stuff. I've written monsters on and off, so those are always fun to play with. I write novels, comics, etc. This is not my first panel of the weekend. You've probably already heard this.
We're just covering the bases just in case. Again, I'm Darren Bush. I'm also a science fiction and fantasy author. But for this discussion, my relevance is that I create a lot of panels and moderate a lot of panels for local Atlanta science fiction and fantasy conventions, including Monsterama. So here we go. So let's start with what's your personal interest in kaiju, big monsters, whatever we want to call them. I'm gonna pick on James first because he seems to have a lot of monsters in his fiction. What's the allure for you personally with big monsters?
From a young age, just watching the Godzilla movies. There's something wonderfully cheesy about what is obviously a guy in a rubber suit knocking over what is obviously cardboard buildings. They're just cool and fun. They're forces of nature. Godzilla is a metaphor for nuclear destruction. You can talk about stuff like global warming, the environment, stuff like that with them. They're really cool. And they just wreck the place.
Okay, excellent. Sarah, what about you? What's the attraction with big monsters?
I'm a sucker for the absurd. So one of my favorite things to do is to take something that doesn't belong in the world that I'm writing and stick it in there. And that's what my troll heist is. It's kind of like that. It's almost like a How I Met Your Mother sitcom starring trolls in Ocean's 11 kind of plot. So it's just a lot of fun to me. And every story I've written that has the larger monsters tends to have that element of absurdity as well.
I hope you have someone wrote that for you as a blurb for the back of your book, because that's an awesome little description there. I like that.
Bobby, how about you? Where do big monsters start for you?
For me, it was probably if not Godzilla, it was the Saturday afternoon. You lay in, as a kid, you're laying in front of the TV watching giant ants or giant grasshoppers or giant fill in the blanks. Those were always pretty cool. But I also, in watching cartoons as a kid, there were quite often giants. They weren't necessarily always monsters, but there were giant things that people were fighting, giant characters. And again, the giant animals. Giant animals always seems to be a big favorite. So there was always something about that, man versus this overwhelming giant thing that I thought was pretty good. I mean, was it Samson and Goliath versus Goliath, that kind of thing. It's fun and it's as Sarah said, it's a bit absurd, and sometimes the more absurd it is, the cooler it is, because it's so weird to see. So yeah, and they
Yeah.
destroy a lot of stuff, like James said.
That can be a lot of fun. When I was a kid, I spent most Thanksgiving weeks in upstate New York with relatives, and up there, one of the local TV stations played nothing but Godzilla movies all day long on Thanksgiving Day. And I think the assumption was the adults were all busy, but the kids were all bored. And it worked because all of my cousins and we just sat in front of the TV and just watched Godzilla all day long. It was great. It was a great introduction to part of it to the absurd, part of it to cardboard buildings being stepped on by a guy in a rubber suit, but also just this this path of a nerd who really likes kaiju and big monsters. So we're really talking about a group of people who write something that they're fans of. Do you find that you have to do you find yourself struggling to stay away from Godzilla and King Kong, or do you embrace those similarities? How does that work for you? I'm going to start with Bobby this time.
Well, you have to be. You don't want it to be too close. I mean, but you can always. I mean, there are tropes like any other genre. There are tropes, and you can play with those tropes. And when you do stuff that is either cliche or has been done to death, you can sometimes do it with a wink and a nod, and make fun of it or add some comedy to it. So there's all different ways of doing it. It just depends on the kind of story you're wanting to tell.
Okay, James, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, my standby is just kind of just the generic dinosaur analog. I don't really do King Kong. For the Monster Earth series, we gave our writers leeway to just we had a few established monsters, and then they came up with their own monsters. And we've got a giant bat with like a sonic death ray. We've got a giant polar bear, a giant hedgehog. I did a story about the love between a boy and his giant spider. And there's an alligator called Electrigator that conducts electricity. Just all kind of just craziness that I wouldn't have thought up on my own. I wouldn't have thought of doing a hedgehog. There's a giant parrot in one story. It's just craziness, which is what I love about it.
Sarah, what about you?
Well, when you're working with something that is so established, you have this whole set of reader expectations coming into it, and it's so much fun to play with those and turn some on their heads and keep others to meet those expectations. We talked a little bit about that with the writing the classic monsters, and that's kind of the approach that I take. As I love to mess with expectations and turn them upside down a little bit. I like putting big characters in tight spaces and things like that. I recently wrote a story about a kraken attacking ship, of course, because as krakens do, and it's a kind of a split perspective where you've got the pirate's perspective, and then you've got the kraken perspective, and really all of her blunders that she's making, they think that she's toying with them. They're cat and mouse kind of game, but really it's because she's been forced to take her spawn with her because he ate his last babysitter. So like it's just a lot of fun to just warp those expectations a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. There's something strangely comforting about the idea of something the size of Godzilla or Cloverfield or whatever stepping on buildings in Manhattan or in Mega Tokyo. It is strange how much glee and delight we take in. Oh yeah, that stadium full of people just got stepped on.
Yeah.
It is a ridiculous, like Sarah said, it's absurd, but also there's definitely that kind of force of nature. We like thinking about the end of the world, but without having to participate, which I think is part of the allure here. So when you grow up as a kid watching Godzilla movies and other big monster movies, is there something I've definitely wanted to ask you guys was how do you translate those images for some of us from our childhood fandom? How do you translate those images into words on the page? Is it possible, and I know I'm asking this, I know I'm going to get a yes answer on this for the most part, is it possible to take the written word and get that sense of majesty and size and scope and power that we see in somebody like Godzilla, who is kind of the poster child here? Sarah, what about you? Do you just, is that an easy yes, or is there something trickier to it?
I mean, I don't think it's an easy yes, but I tend to be an underwriter, and I pack a lot of punch and meaning into every word that I use in a sentence. I tend to I write my first draft for an 80,000 word novel tends to be in the 27-30,000 word range. And then I expand things out because I'm like, okay, people are not going to follow my weird brain. So I need to get in there and add some more description and things like that. But yeah, I mean, I think it is possible. It's definitely challenging, especially translating that image from my own head and those, especially that the senses and the aesthetics in a way that the reader is going to follow. So it's a challenge, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, James, with you in your writing, how do you give us that sense of size and scope?
I don't know if it's something I can quantify. I think just using, every time you describe the creature, kind of try to come up with a new way to say that it's big. It's enormous claws. It's vast jaws, whatever, and to kind of keep conveying that this isn't a little creature, crashing through a wall. This is a giant monster stepping on a city. But yeah, I think it can be done. It may not be as visual as a Godzilla movie, but I think it can be every bit as striking, for sure.
Okay, Bobby, what about you? How do you find that?
Too, a lot of it you can get a lot from going from the point of view of people seeing the monster. If somebody's on the 24th floor and they look out the window and there's the monster's head, that can help you with size, falling on buildings, stepping on buildings, stepping on landmarks people know. That's why in movies the Statue of Liberty gets destroyed so often. People know how big that is, or they have an idea of how big that is. Things like that. You can do stuff that way. There's also things we can do in the writing to ramp up the action when things like that happen. If you want to speed up the story, short, choppy sentences, you read that faster so it feels faster. So there's little tricks like that we can do in the actual telling of the story. But to get for size, I find other people's point of view is pretty good because you don't want to do the big info dump. He stood 300 feet, feet tall. You don't want to do that.
Okay.
Definitely that point of reference that you were talking about. That's definitely something I think is really effective.
And they do that in movies too. I mean, if you think about it, like if they're in New York, they have them bumping up against buildings that are known. That you see them next to the Empire State Building, or there's a reason King Kong climbed the World Trade Center. That told you exactly how high up in the air he was, without them having to info dump all that to you.
Right.
So have any of you done that in your writing? Use familiar landmarks?
Yeah.
You got to give me an example, Bobby.
Oh, well, I did a book that it hasn't come out yet that takes place inside Stone Mountain, which is a fairly well-known park here in Georgia. That in the real world is not hollow like in my story, but at least as far as I know. Yeah. So using the size of the mountain helped me when using the size of the creatures living in the mountain, and it never hurts when you describe things like it was as big as an SUV, or because you can still have giant monsters that aren't building height, one of my, I mean, and even science fiction does that, like the alien queen in Aliens is this huge, creature. Or even when you get down to closer things like Jaws is abnormally large shark. You know, they make it a point to say that we don't see sharks this big around, that kind of thing. Or, you know, if it's a bear, it's a bear bigger than we're usually, you know, so you can describe those things by comparing them size wise to objects people know.
James, were you going to say something?
No, I'm just agreeing with Bobby. I haven't really destroyed any landmarks in my stuff.
Now, one of the Monster Earth covers has oh shoot, Big Ben. Is it Big Ben being destroyed or?
Oh, that's that's the novel. That's well, no, but I didn't write that story.
Okay.
That was Desmond Reddick. The new cover for Monster Earth has a kraken attacking Pearl Harbor instead of what we what actually happened at Pearl Harbor. I've got my laptop propped up. This is the cover for that.
Nice.
Oh yeah. So we're
Jeffrey Hayes cover, right?
Yes.
Yes.
So what we're looking at, if I see that correctly, James, that's an aircraft carrier.
Yes.
In the foreground, basically.
Yes.
Yeah. So for those of you who don't know,
an aircraft carrier.
Yeah. For those of you who aren't familiar with aircraft carriers, even in World War II, gigantic ships. That's a great example of what you're talking about. That the thing didn't just walk up to a shrimp boat and go. It went up to an aircraft carrier.
Right. And it's tossing around like a rubber duck in a bathtub.
Mm-hmm.
And then you got smaller monsters here. This is my novel Archer of Venus. So this is like an alien critter, and there's the little hero there.
Mm-hmm.
He's big, but he's not Godzilla size.
Right.
So.
Okay.
But just like point of reference helps with an artist, putting that in your stories too, so people get a sense of how big it is. My story for Monster Earth, they're going looking for a sea dwelling monster, and they use I got the idea from an old Roger Zelazny story. It's basically a kind of a ship the size of like 4 oil derricks put together, because that's how big they need to rope this thing, because they're trying to catch it alive. Roger Zelazny wrote this story about hunting a sea monster on Venus called The Doors of His Face, The Lamps of His Mouth, and that they're fishing from like oil derricks. That's how big the critter is they're trying to catch.
Mm-hmm.
But by using stuff like you mentioned, when you said Pearl Harbor, in my head, I had an immediate idea of what that was. Now, I wasn't there personally, but how many times has that appeared in movies? We've seen documentaries.
Oh, yeah.
We know everybody has some semblance of what Pearl Harbor looks like.
Yeah.
So that actually really helps, because you've put your audience in something they recognize.
Yeah.
So as far as being able to help describe the monster, and not just size, that is a key element of what we're talking about, but also to give it a sense of absurdity, give it a sense of danger. Why is it that so many of these stories have a scientist in them?
It's the old scientist as hero trope. The only guy that knows what's going on is the scientist. And everybody, even like the military, kind of bows to him for his expertise. What is this thing? How do we kill it? What do we do? That kind of stuff. They never look like scientists actually look in the real world. They're all these lantern-jawed, handsome guys that have more than one specialty for some reason. But but it's the scientist as hero. Which is, that's something science fiction is famous for.
Or the scientist being ignored.
Right.
I think they quit killing the scientists, personally.
Yeah.
Wait, say that again, Sarah?
I wish they'd quit killing the scientists.
Right.
Because the person that knows what's going on is usually one of the first one killed off.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, if you think about it, like, and it even goes into other types of genres. I mean, we wouldn't have Superman if the Kryptonians had listened to Jor-El, you know?
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Godzilla, as I think somebody already said, is a representation of the threat of atomic war and
Mhm.
atomic energy. It's not subtle at all. It's right there from the very beginning. They just said it. He's a mutated lizard from the Bikini Islands or something like that, somewhere like that. But so the scientists, besides the fact that these scientists all seem to be incredibly athletic and heroic, and some of them know Morse code, even though they're biologists or zoologists. I'm not sure where that comes in to their training, but besides the fact that they're a little too heroic sometimes, little too multitasking there for these guys, for reality. Why is it that we feel compelled to put so many scientists into the stories as heroic characters or even as secondary characters? Like, as a counterpoint, why not just have a scientist do the info dump and then step off stage for the rest of the story?
Well,
Does that
that's
make
not very
sense?
compelling. I mean,
Not?
you want to care about your characters, right? You don't want someone to
Mhm.
just show up and be like, "Oh, yes, check my chart. You guys are all screwed." Like, I mean,
Yeah. Well, and it's usually the scientist that's out in the field that makes the discovery. You know, he
Mhm.
finds the dinosaur egg or the creature frozen in ice or whatever.
Mhm.
So he's boots on the ground, before anybody else, before the military gets called in.
Yeah. Or no one believes the scientist, so the scientist is out to prove his or her theory or his or her claim is true.
well, I
Right.
think
That's
that's such a theme, because I mean, when you're writing science fiction, I think that a lot of times you do have these bigger messages within your story, that James was talking about in the opening, that so you kind of want to set up some kind of sense of credibility, and also put that warning in there that, pay attention or else.
Yeah.
So part of the scientist's role in these stories is also, I think, to be a counterpoint to the military reaction, which is kind of part of the fun of these stories. I think there's a mix of the very kind of Schwarzenegger kind of, we must get our guns and go save the day, but also it's sometimes just kind of fun to see the tanks have no effect at all, and the
Yeah.
airplanes get, like King Kong swatting airplanes out of the sky. Even as a kid, I was going, they're in airplanes, fly higher, guys. Don't come. Like, do they not understand that they can fly up?
Well, I
How,
also think too the scientist has to be there because we watching it or reading it are not scientists. So there's always going to be someone the scientist is explaining it to. So we, the audience, are getting explained to what's going on.
Mhm. So how do you, with your scientist characters, how do you draw the line between the necessary exposition to get things moving and what threatens to become an info dump? How do you balance that with your scientists, especially when there's a big monster coming?
I think just spacing things out, show don't tell. This the
Mhm.
basic, storytelling 101 kind of stuff. And that may be another reason why too they make the scientist the hero, or at least part of the action, so it's not such an obvious, here's Dr. Frank and he's going to explain this with a chart and a video and then leave and you never see him again.
Yeah, I think definitely spacing it out through dialogue is probably the best way,
Yeah.
and that's, if you have two characters that are really compelling that can do the back and forth well, that's a good way to get it, get the information out there.
Yep.
Yeah.
Is there value in writing a story about a kaiju and not explaining? I have a specific example in mind, but I'm wondering if you guys ever think about or tinker with not explaining what's really going on, whether you understand the monster or not.
Well, I guess you could do one where you just go, it's a big monster. Where'd it come from? I have no idea. But it's destroying Tokyo. Do something, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, you could do that, but if you're going to do it, you still have to have compelling characters to keep that story interesting.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you, as a fan and as a writer, do you prefer the puzzle solving part of the monster stories?
Dogs, I'm muting.
I'm gonna go with 3 maybes there. So, but no, okay. So let me put you guys on the spot. Sarah, as a fan of monsters, are you interested in the scientist and the soldier figuring out how to solve the puzzle of whatever puzzle the monster has created?
Oh, I love having the scientist figure it out, of course. I mean, I think all of us kind of grew up on the nerdier side, not necessarily on the action, go hunt it down. So when you're doing that brawn versus brains, I definitely want to follow along with the brainy one. That's why I say quit killing them. Of course, the only scientist I ever wrote, I kill. But
right.
But yeah, I think it's fun. I actually like I like withholding the answers from my characters, but not from the reader sometimes.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of cool when it all makes sense to the person who's following the story, but your readers are just left with this kind of like nihilistic, well, what was that all for? You know, I might be a little sadistic in my writing.
Well, we are talking about monsters stepping on cities. James, what about you? As a fan, as a writer, do you prefer the sciencey part of these stories, the puzzle solving?
I don't know necessarily with giant monsters, because if you start looking under that rock, then if somebody brings up the square cube law, and then it's all over with. So I try not to peek too heavily under that rock so much. Hang on one second.
So Bobby, what about you?
I like having the characters talk to each other. I think the scientist generally knows what's going on. The scientist can give the military guys ideas, and you can even have these stories where they don't have either of those type of characters in them. I mean, you know, there have been successful ones that have one or the other or neither, but you know, there's a reason scientists know things. They're, you know, if someone's, that's their field, we should listen to them. I think having them involved in these stories could be, you know, very beneficial. And sometimes you get, you know, where sometimes the scientist there can be a good scientist and a bad scientist, you know. Your characters can be doing all this stuff around the giant monster. And that's where that's where you start getting into the deeper meanings. You know, unless you get in the monster's head. Like a lot of books don't get in the monster's head. It's just there's the monster, here's the characters, they're dealing with the monster. So depending on which way you go, you know, you can you know, write it however. But you know, I do enjoy solving the problem. But I also like playing fair so that when we get to the end, I don't want that one piece of thing that stops the monster to be something that they pull out of thin air. Mm-hmm. You know, I like it to be something that when it happens, they go, aha, you know, they planted a seed. I remember that. And so I like to make sure we play fair with the audience.
Oh yeah, I agree. I am never a fan of where the solution is something that just came out of somebody's back pocket at the last minute and there's no warning at all. Mm-hmm. It does not work. Sarah, were you going to say something about that? Okay, so
I was doing the aha.
Oh yeah, I was wondering. I'm wondering if you had more for us there.
But that's a wonderful thing too, as a reader, when you get to these things and well, those aha moments are wonderful because one, the writer did a really good job of planting those seeds, but they did it in a way that it stuck with me. So later when it's used, you know, that's wonderful. I mean, I love those moments when they happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I struggle with doing that. I have a book right now that I'm writing that's a serial killer story. It's a magical serial killer story. And I really struggle because I feel like I'm littering all these clues and then people are like, oh, wait, that came out of nowhere. So then I did a revision and I gave it back to my CPs and they're like, oh, that was obvious.
Yeah, because when you're writing it, sometimes it like if you especially any kind of mystery, when you're writing it, it almost feels like there's a neon sign going, "Here's the killer."
Yes, yes.
So it's because I know who it is. So planting those clues, it's hard to it's a juggling act to figure out how much or how little. It's tough. It's tough to plant clues.
Yeah, and also, and we've talked about this on a panel that we've recorded previously. Bobby, I think you were in on this conversation, um, where you've got this, you want to have this surprise in the middle or near the end, and it's on the book cover,
Mhm.
right? So James showed us a couple of book covers that were really beautiful, but it's like, okay, there's no way that in chapter 5 you're going to be shocked that there's a giant frog monster chasing somebody through a cave. That surprise is gone. I think that one of the funny things about Godzilla movies, especially, is that the name of the movie is Godzilla and whoever the second monster, whoever the other monster is. There's a lot of his Godzilla verses. So there's a couple of Godzilla movies over the years where you're sitting there going, wasn't Godzilla in this movie? It's no surprise at all that Godzilla shows up and then some other monster that's even worse than Godzilla shows up. So there's that kind of it is, and inside my head this sounded like a terrible dad joke, but it's true. It is hard to sneak up on your audience with a giant monster. I apologize.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Well, it's okay, but what you can do now, not having read I haven't read that story that was on the cover James showed, but what could where you can surprise your audience is not that there's a giant monster at Pearl Harbor. What if that monster turns out to be the good guy? Or because Godzilla has flip flopped back and forth between being the villain and the hero, so sometimes you can play with that expectation. But yeah,
Or you make it the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man.
there you go. Yeah.
That was a surprise, right?
Which I definitely classify him as a kaiju.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And they were really good at setting him up because we saw like packages of Stay Puft Marshmallows earlier on her when she was undoing groceries. I think we saw it on an ad somewhere too. So it was. Yeah. So when it seems like it comes out of nowhere, but on that second viewing, you're like, aha.
Yeah. Yeah. The fact that Ray was thinking about Stay Puft Marshmallows was not actually a shock the way they built it visually. Yeah. They did a very good job of that. So you do kind of have to drop some hints early on. And I imagine there's like a top 10 list of the hints that kaiju writers have dropped, like the water glass trembling from Jurassic Park. I think Jurassic Park made that really, really obvious first, but now everybody does it. It's like almost every movie with a big enough creature in it has got a puddle of water or a bottle of Coke or something shaking on screen. And I think that with the big monsters, yeah, that's a great way to give you a sense of scale and power. But also, it's become a little cliched, tiny bit cliche that the water is shaking.
Yeah. Well, the one thing I thought the Jurassic Park movie did that was very clever because all the advertising was going to show the T-Rex. You knew it, we knew it, they knew it. The T-Rex is going to be the thing that gets people to this movie. It's going to be in all the advertising. And so when we go up to where we're told we're going to meet the T-Rex, we don't see it for another 10 minutes. Right. So it starts subverting our expectations. We're like, I thought we're kind of doing with the guys in the car. Like there were going to be dinosaurs in here, right? And so then when it happens, it doesn't happen when we expected it. So it still gets us.
Mm-hmm. Does that work in writing also? Can you write a chapter with no monster in it at all, even though it was supposed to be there? The same way Jurassic Park did it visually?
Why not?
Yeah. You just have different tools,
Okay.
Do you want to know what some of them are? I know.
I want. I'm gonna get a sign that says "Please elaborate."
Please elaborate. Yeah, you can do. I mean, you can do things like your character, your point of view character. You can have their thoughts of why isn't this happening? Whether it's the guy going, I thought there were going to be dinosaurs on this ride, or I've got a bad feeling about this guy, or the guy that's so anxious. If you got in any one of those characters' heads, in a novel, which is harder to do in a movie, you can ramp up the reader's expectation and anxiety because you've ramped up the character's expectation and anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
Does that sound right? Yeah.
Okay. Sarah, do you have anything to add to that? Okay, all right, just leave me hanging there. That's fine. So you guys have mentioned a few times about getting inside the monster's head. Do we want to get inside the monster's head as an audience, as fans, or is that part of the larger, is that part of the package of messages? Like, if we knew what Godzilla was thinking, would he be less effective as a moral lesson or a consequence?
Well, I think, with Godzilla, it almost seems like a force of nature.
Mm-hmm.
So, but again, it depends on the kind of story. Like, I'm curious to hear what Sarah said, because she said you did get inside the head of your Kraken. So what was the reason for that? Was it just because it made the story more sense for that story, or?
Yeah, that was the foundation of the story. I was writing about Mother Kraken, and how I have a scene where my captain is like listening to a story of a Kraken that got pulled away by something, and he gets chills, and he's like, what could control a beast like this hell beast? And it's her kid. I mean, it's just, I think I'm coming at this question and probably this whole panel from a little bit of a different perspective, because I don't necessarily write kaiju as science fiction. I'm a fantasy author who tends to do some satire and things like that. So getting inside the heads of the monsters is a great way for me to be able to make those statements that I'm trying to make. If I'm trying to make a statement, I'm not always trying to make a statement.
So does
it sounds like in that particular case, the Kraken becomes more sympathetic, because anybody that has kids understands, Mom, I'm hurt. And Mom drops everything and takes care of the kid. I'm assuming that's probably what you're seeing too, is people are empathizing with the Kraken more.
It's actually it's been submitted to an anthology, and I don't know whether it's going to get published or not yet.
Okay.
So I don't know how people are going to.
It's a great idea. So hopefully,
but it's a parenting and science fiction fantasy anthology. So
well, there you go.
Yeah.
There you go.
But yeah, I don't think the goal though was necessarily to sympathize with the Kraken. It's just that there's no matter who you are, those little monsters are gonna be pulling your strings. So.
But also, like, I'm curious, does the inner dialogue in Mama Kraken's head, does it contradict the people that are reacting to her presence or the baby's presence?
So it's almost like two separate stories. You've got the captain and the first mate, and the first mate has lived through a Kraken attack before, and there's so you've got this very typical kind of story going on at the same time, and that they never converge, they never cross over. So the pirates, they don't really go away thinking anything, but the reader leaves thinking the pirates still have the same exact image of a Kraken, and it's just a random attack, and it was never random, and it was not nearly as designed and flawless as it looked to them. And so it's just, I just love playing with the concept of perception, and everybody's perception is framed by their own experience, and that's a theme in pretty much everything I write, is that things are never there is no ultimate truth.
Well, Sarah, we're not trying to pick on you. It's just, I love the idea that you've put the reader inside the head of a Kraken, especially a Mama Kraken, who I assume is I'd love to see the story and see how you work out the scale, but I can just imagine the pirate going, there's the Kraken, and then there's this much bigger thing behind the baby Kraken. It's the Mama Kraken. I love the idea of that, but also I think it's unusual for people to take what is essentially, another kind of kaiju, and give them not just behaviors that, like, the dog psychologist can chew on, but to actually give them motivation and dialogue and inner dialogue. I think that's interesting. I can't think of a second example. Now, of course, I haven't read extensively. Like, I haven't read all of James's stories and his stuff. Bobby, can you think of
not
an example?
in my head? Well, if memory serves, there's a little bit in King Kong where they do talk about what King Kong is feeling or the reaction to seeing the girl, and I think it's mentions, but it's not like we never get in his head to where he's like, "Ooh, we don't get that." And I think for the most part, in these type of monster books and movies, it's always the monster is usually a force of nature that we don't understand. We cannot think like they do. Because I mean, if you think of like, especially like movies, imagine if we were inside the T-Rex's head in Jurassic Park. What would that be like? Or but I think in books though, we have more of an opportunity to say, even if it's a creature like King Kong or the T-Rex, we can still write things like they noticed something and they saw this and it stirred a familiar reaction in them, or so we can do stuff like that. But I have not fully like put myself in on like the monster's, head, but there's certainly nothing wrong with it.
I think that's purposeful, though. I think that in most of the kaiju stories, they are allegories for something else that is happening. Whereas like the things that I'm trying to write, I'm a little bit of a chaos demon. So I'm just telling whatever story happens to pop into my head. And it doesn't necessarily have any kind of direct correlation to the real world, but there are correlations that you can find. They're just not where you might expect them to. But I think it's just, I think as a genre, I think science fiction has so much of that stuff that was pre-planned and thought out ahead of time, and I'm an outlier.
And sometimes these things happen. I mean, I know with my story, sometimes it looks like there's a plan when I'm done. Right. There was no plan. I get to the end and I'm like, oh, great, that's awesome. Now I got to go back and set that stuff up.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what revisions are for.
Yeah. I would love to say that I go into these things with a perfectly laid out plan, but that would be a perfect lie.
All right. Well, then that is a perfect place for me to exploit what you just said to ask one of the questions on my list, which is, how do you do research on a 600-foot tall lizard stepping on Tokyo?
Well, you watch some movies.
Right.
Yeah.
In this case, they're documentaries.
Yeah, well, I mean, you just, like I said, there are tropes. We know if you're going to have a giant monster movie, there's going to be at least one building gets knocked down. Because if you don't, your readers are going to be like, well, what happened? That's why these things never fight out in the desert, So that's there. There are tropes in every genre. It's like, if you're going to have two superpowered characters, there's at some point they're going to fight, and one of them is going to get thrown through a wall or a building or something. You put Godzilla fighting Mega Godzilla. One of them is going to crash through a building. It's just an inevitable thing. So, knowing that that's going to be there, I try to work it in, where I can, and yeah.
Okay. So that was an excellent non-answer, Bobby. I appreciate that.
It's other than just watching what other people have done and going, I like that worked, or I didn't like that, I don't want to do that. And if you're going to steal from the best.
That must be an awesome paycheck, to be an architect who's an advisor to a Godzilla movie about how buildings fall over and how they crash. So Sarah, if I remember correctly, you've got some biology education in you. That was a terrible way to put that, but you know what I mean. How do you apply your knowledge of natural philosophy essentially to your Kraken, to your monsters?
Absolutely. You can't help but do that kind of thing. I mean, I went to school for 4 years for a bio degree, so
there we go.
I mean, it's coded in me, but honestly, it's not even really the bio degree that I use as much as it is. I was a wildlife rehabilitator for a long time. I was a veterinary technician, and my bio degree was actually centered on more on animal behavior and ecology. So those kind of concepts are important to me, and they absolutely inform my creatures. One of the articles that I wrote for Dan Cobalt's series was about using biology to craft monsters. And really the core of it is about using the world that we know and then expanding, crossing, or building upon it in order to make something that is both familiar and unexpected at the same time. And I don't know that I necessarily do it intentionally, but I definitely do it.
Okay. So Sarah, I want to, oh, go ahead, Bobby, go ahead.
And it makes sense too. Especially if you're writing a giant version of something that already exists. Like I wrote giant ants in the first Hunter Houston story. I researched ants, even though they're giant ants that can talk and shoot molten lava out of, they're still ants. So I wanted to make sure I had the ant part right before I put the sci-fi part or the fantasy part on top of it.
Yeah, I researched giant squid for the Kraken story and incorporated a lot of that stuff. And then I also looked to see what lore was out there already. And it was funny because there was a lot of crossover. So I think that that's a typical way that writers do that.
Mm-hmm. So also, so Sarah, I did have one question I wanted to ask. Is there a simple, straightforward way to explain to lay people about the cube squared law, which is I think that's one of those pillar pieces of biology, or at least zoology?
I don't know what that is.
Oh, you don't know what it is? Oh, I'm
No.
sorry. we'll edit this part out.
It's been a long time.
We'll edit this part out. Okay, so basically, I think Bobby brought it up. I just want to lay out really quickly. The cube squared law is the idea that the bigger an animal gets, the more complicated it gets for it to get bigger. That's my lay interpretation of that law, is that an ant that was 50 feet tall probably could not stand, right? Mm-hmm. Science fiction and fantasy, they walk all over the place. They walk up and down buildings. It's awesome. But in reality, the reason why like water bugs are a good example. They float on water. They don't float on water. They're so lightweight that the water actually holds them up just fine. It's not anything magical about it. Insects are small because they have to be because of this rule. So the number of animals that are this big is billions, and the number of animals the size of an elephant is elephants, and that's it. And it's because of that rule from biology that, again, the bigger you get, the harder it is to get bigger. So anyway, so that's what that is. So that brings us back to
that makes sense. You have to combat the natural forces of Earth. I mean, you've got gravity and you've got all these things that you have to. I mean, surface tension of water. You were talking about the water bugs and things like that. So that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So it is part of the kaiju conversation, is that they are so monstrously big, they're so huge that they border on impossible just because they're 600 feet tall. So anybody who says that this is a realistic kaiju, I'm like, what does that mean? What do you?
They would probably collapse in on themselves.
They really would. But that's all part of the fun. Is, I think Sarah said very early on, is this? It's just kind of an absurd thing. Is I've got this really gorgeous city. Let's destroy it. Stomp, 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 stomp. Which is part of the fun. So okay, so we're starting to run out of time here. I do want to ask one more thing about this, about the monsters. And we've talked about forces of nature, and we've talked a little bit about messages. Do we still have more messages to tell through giant monsters? Basically, is what I'm getting at. Bobby, have you snuck any messages or morals into your monsters?
Sometimes. I mean, allegory is a wonderful thing when you're writing horror, sci-fi, fantasy, things like that. Using monsters or aliens or creatures to mirror a problem that happens in the real world is a time-honored tradition. It goes back longer than I've been alive, So sometimes you can work those in there. Sometimes you can beat them over the head with it. Like I said, Godzilla is not subtle, Although the newer ones don't really play as much into that. It's just, here's Godzilla. So, I mean, it depends on, the writing of it, I guess. But so, yeah, sometimes I've stuck little things in there, but, nothing, no big, I'm not that deep. I'm not that clever. It's like, yeah, big monster, bad guy, but little things you can put in there, like, just this is, I did in the Houston story that with the giant ants inside Stone Mountain, there's a bit there about it's not just one kind of ant, it's multiple kinds of ants, but they're all giant and there's giant colonies. And so my play on it was each of those the ants are all part of a lineage, and it's almost like there's a royal family. These guys are soldiers, these guys are, and there's a civil war happening. So I could use allegories about the Civil War or the War of 1812 or whatever, and I can use bits of that in telling that story. So using history helped, but I wasn't really, I wasn't trying to beat like a particular message, but just here's how it played out, by using history in my silly sci-fi story.
And I want to say there's absolutely plenty of room in the world for enjoyable escapism in science fiction and fantasy, especially with big monsters. So to me, it is not a necessity for there to be a message, but I do occasionally like it when they sneak one in on us. Sarah, you've said a couple of times that you write satire. Is it satire? Do you have are you satirizing specific people for specific reasons, or is it just a general, I think you said chaos demon?
Yeah, pretty much.
How does the satire get served by monsters?
Well, Double Crossing the Bridge, I mean, on its surface level, it's a story about drunk trolls pulling heist. I have themes of misogyny. I have themes of racism. I have little jabs here and there about things that I've seen going on in the world around me. I've got there's definitely layers, and I feel like if you're writing a convincing society, again, I'm coming from the fantasy perspective, not from the sci-fi, if you're writing a convincing society, and that is one of the tenets of world building in fantasy, then there's going to be these kind of elements. There's going to be things happening. The world is a complicated place, and when when human beings or trolls or even I would assume kaiju interact, there's going to be some kind of dynamics that are at play there. And so it's almost impossible to keep it completely out, to keep these kind of messages. So you asked if there's any more messages, and I think that of course there are. We're always learning and growing, and you're always talking to new people. And so if that's where you're trying to go, that was not where I was trying to go. And I think that's probably one of the points, one of the forks in the road. It's like, okay, am I writing this to create this allegory, or am I writing it to tell this story? And I'm always a storyteller. I'm following the story, but all that stuff just kind of filters in.
Yeah, I'm making a point no matter what I'm writing, I try to make sure all the characters are not just another version of me. Mm-hmm. So that means there can be good heroic characters that are still a bit of a butthole, to people. I was trying to be nice there, Zeds. You can have people that are not nice in this area of their life, but can still be a hero, or can still be nice in this area. But you can shine little lights on that just makes that character, because it's one of those weird things that people that are that way in real life don't always know they're that way. And they recognize it in a character and go, well, that guy shouldn't act like that. And people are going like, but you act like that, So your characters can do a lot of stuff like that shines lights on, the differences in people, because we're not all the same. And there are, because that's one of the things that always bugged me about some sci-fi shows. They go to a planet and everybody on that planet is one thing. Mm-hmm. And that's not the world we live on. Hell, that's not the neighborhood I live in.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Excellent. Okay. Well, so now I am at the end of this discussion. I'm motivated to make a T-shirt that says Godzilla is the hero of his story.
Love it.
I think that would be very amusing, especially wandering around Monsterama next year when we get back together. Hopefully, when we get back together. So, guys, thank you so much for that very interesting discussion. That huge, gigantic discussion, because obviously size can matter. What I want to do is ask you guys to let us know where the fans can find you on the interwebs. I'm going to let Sarah go first this time.
I am at sarahjsover.com and across all platforms as Sarah J. Sover. I'm over here teasing all kinds of fun things on Instagram about Monsterama, but I'm mostly active on Twitter.
Excellent. Bobby, where can we track you down?
I am BobbyNash.com is my website. I'm on social media. Unfortunately, I've been on social media so long that none of mine are the same anymore, but for different reasons. But I'm at author Bobby Nash on Facebook. I'm at Bobby Nash on Twitter, and I'm at Bobby Nash Writes on Instagram.
Excellent. And I'm still Darren Bush. You can find my short stories on the Kindle on my author's page on Amazon. And I want to remind everybody, don't forget that Virtual Monsterama 2020 is benefiting the MPTF, the Motion Picture and Television Fund, which provides temporary financial assistance for needs created or complicated by the COVID-19 pandemic. To learn more and to donate, please go to mptf.com. Again, that's mptf.com. And if you're considering whether to donate or not, first of all, let me say, please do so, because these people are the folks that make your kaiju movies and television shows. So please, let's support them. And I want to thank you guys for a very interesting discussion. Thank you for coming back on another Monsterama panel. We're going to say good night. Good night.